Hey, great. So today I'll talk about psychopharmacology and self-transcendent experience. So a lot of times in psychology, the interventions and the eliciting stimuli are social or interpersonal or intrapersonal in orientation. And more rarely are they a particular substance. But in my new department in psychiatry, even though I was trained in psychology, I'm now in psychiatry. This is quite common. But I think it's an area that's underexplored in psychology. So today I hope to raise some interesting questions to you about the capacity for certain kinds of psychoactive compounds to result in very interesting psychological experiences. So it's great to be speaking with you all virtually. So I'm based at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine at the Bayview campus. If any of you come to the US to visit, I invite you to come to Baltimore and come visit our center. And I'll put up here the QR code to visit my lab's website, where you can learn more about all of the various kind of work that we're doing. Only some of it I'll be able to speak about today. So just a little bit about myself. These are my primary advisors that I've had in my academic journey. The first, Andrew Newberg, is a neuroscientist who studies the brain changes associated with meditation, prayer, and various kinds of spiritual or self-transcendent states. I did my master's work with him, and I co-authored a book with him that I'll speak about. My doctoral advisor was Marty Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania, where my work focused on how brief experiences could have sometimes long-lasting positive effects, and especially altered states of consciousness were my primary focus. So my aim with Marty was to update and move into the 21st century William James's pioneering work on different altered states of consciousness and how they can be beneficial to humans under certain circumstances. I did try a number of interventions and manipulations to try to induce these kinds of intense and meaningful altered states of consciousness in a laboratory setting during my doctoral work, and mostly failed. I tried non-invasive brain stimulation, virtual reality, meditation, several other forms of intervention, and found that all of these were lacking in producing the kinds of intensely altered states of consciousness that I was most interested in. So I went to Johns Hopkins and retrained with Roland Griffiths as a psychopharmacologist during my doctoral work there in the behavioral pharmacology research unit. And now I'm here at Johns Hopkins, and I have a named professorship named after Roland Griffiths, who established the chair after he passed away. So I know it's early there. You're just starting off your day. So that's enough about me. Let's delve into this topic. But first, I am wondering if you're willing, if you can do an imagination exercise with me, just to get a sense, a felt sense for our topic. So if you're comfortable, if you could put your feet flat on the floor, your hands on your thighs, take a nice deep breath in and close your eyes. And as you breathe out, bring to mind a memory of what you feel to be an intensely altered state of consciousness or a self-transcendent experience, whatever those words mean to you right now. So try to just settle on one particular experience that you think might fit those categories. And as you settle on just one very particular experience, one moment in time, just settle on one, try to remember how you felt, any emotions that you felt, any sights, sounds, tastes, a sense of touch, smell, how your body felt, any kind of visuals in your mind, any images, any emotions associated with those images, any thoughts. And then take a moment to reflect how that experience impacted you in the hours, days, maybe even weeks or longer after your experience. And we'll call that our index experience. So take a nice deep breath in. And as you breathe out, you can open your eyes back to the room. Okay, so hopefully that was refreshing, and hopefully now we all have an index experience in mind, so that as I go through the various conceptual work, the empirical work, and the research findings on this topic, you can refer back to your own experience and to see whether the data fit your own feelings around your own experience. Okay, so here's a little exercise. And the idea here is we see two descriptions of experiences. And these are the kind of experiences that some of you may have brought to mind with your index experience. And here's the test. These experiences are what a professor named Houston Smith used to write on the board when he was teaching at Princeton. He would write these two experiences on the board, and he would say, guess which one was triggered by a psychedelic and which one was not. Okay, so this is your task. Try to guess which one was triggered by the psychedelic and which one was not. And to make it easier, we'll just say, try to guess which one was triggered by the psychedelic. And if you're on Zoom, you can use the chat and just indicate number 1 or number 2. And then if you're in the room, I'll ask you to raise your hands. But I'll just give 2 minutes of time to read through these experiences. Okay, so let's get the guesses. I actually see the chat already filling up. I'm seeing a lot of number 2s, some number 1s. How about in the room? So who guesses for a psychedelic experience, who guesses number 1? Raise your hand.
How many guests raise your hand? Number 1. I can count for you, Professor. Yeah.
Okay, great.
No one picks one.
Okay, how about number 2?
Oh, almost everyone in the room.
Okay, great. It looks like on the chat, it's a little bit more 50-50, although going number 2, it looks like the majority. And number 2 is actually incorrect. So it was actually number 1 that was triggered by the psychedelic. Number 2 is an account by a thinker named Buck, who describes a spontaneous altered state of consciousness coming to his mind after a group poetry reading as he was leaving it. So the number 1 was the one triggered by the psychedelic. Now, there are many, many examples of these experiences described throughout history, depicted potentially on cave paintings from thousands of years ago, depicted in art, definitely discussed amongst the ancient Greeks, and described by the founder of almost every major world religion. It's actually difficult to describe or to identify a major world religion where the founder did not describe a profoundly altered state of consciousness of some kind. So this is a serious strain throughout human history across cultures. And here's an example of yet another kind of experience. This one occurred spontaneously. This is a woman who was a Christian describing a feeling of oneness with nature, a sense of self-loss, and perception of a supreme power. And this is from William James's Varieties of Religious Experience. William James was among the founders of empirical psychology. And you can find accounts like these in many of the world's religious texts. You can also find accounts like these in books written by atheists and agnostics. And so you see here well-known atheists such as Bertrand Russell, for example, who described a profoundly altered state of consciousness that he found quite meaningful and positively impacted his life, according to him. And here's that description from Bertrand Russell. This is from his autobiography. He said at the end of those 5 minutes, he had become a completely different person. And he describes this experience as having an impact for decades of his life. He describes it as a kind of mystic illumination. And interestingly, he describes aspects of it as delusions. He came to interpret parts of his experience as delusions, yet he nonetheless benefited from his experience. And overall, he did not attribute this experience to anything supernatural, unlike the founders of many world religions and other people. So what this means, I think, is that we can use a conceptual tool offered to us by the philosopher Husserl, who is a phenomenologist. And the idea of bracketing is to bracket an experience and to think about how the experience feels rather than interpreting the experience. And so when we went through the exercise of imagining and remembering that index experience, note that I didn't ask for your interpretations or your attributions related to the experience. It was focused on how it actually felt in the moment. And so when we do this, we can focus in on the experience and bracket out, so to speak, our various interpretations of the experience. So if you're a philosopher or a theologian, of course, the interpretation is maybe the most interesting part. But as a psychologist, I think the experience is the more interesting part, and we can hold these philosophical and theological questions off to the side and focus instead on what can be measured and what is measurable. And this is precisely the approach recommended by William James, who I've mentioned several times now, in his classic book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, which I think is a classic book in psychology, and I highly recommend it. And in this book, James describes how altering our normal waking consciousness, as he calls it, can result in different forms of consciousness. And this is pretty close to the way we talk about altered states of consciousness. Here he uses forms of consciousness entirely different. It's just a little bit more of a wordy way of saying the same thing, I think. And the book that I mentioned that I wrote with Andy Newberg is an homage to William James's book. It's really our attempt to get people to go read the original, which is excellent. We try to carry some of William James's primary points forward, and then we review psychology, neuroscience, and psychopharmacology that's been done in the past 3 decades on this topic. Now, these experiences are a little bit more common than one might imagine. And so here again is a brief exercise that I'll ask the audience to take part in. The question here is, what you see on the screen is a question. Have you ever felt as though you were close to a powerful spiritual force that seemed to lift you out of yourself? The question is, what percentage of the US population do you think agrees with this question? So you have to write this in really quick so that you don't have time to chat GPT it or Google it. But so if you're on Zoom, go ahead and put your percentage in. If you're in the room, register it in your mind. What percent of the US population would completely agree with this question? So pop that in the chat, what your guess is. And so I'm seeing some come in. Okay, so I'm seeing 80%, 20%. If you're in the room, feel free to just call out some percentages.
15? 15? Okay, we got 15 from the room.
Okay, great. So I'm seeing everything from 15 to 90. Which is fantastic. That's a great range because that means there's a lot of uncertainty around this. And unlike most topics in psychology, there actually is an answer in this, at least according to this particular survey. And the answer is 40%. So 40% indicated that yes, they had felt as if they were close to a powerful spiritual force. And remarkably, this question is altered, and when it's asked in different ways, the percent endorsement is quite similar over time. And so it ends up being about 35% of people will say that they've had one of these profound, meaningful altered states of consciousness. And these experiences that I'm referring to go under a variety of names. Everything I've mentioned, William James called them religious experience. He thought forms of consciousness entirely different was too wordy and too abstract, and he thought most people really call these religious experiences. Spiritual, mystical, religious, spiritual, and mystical, numinous, peak, transpersonal. So you look at this list, and many of these literatures overlap dramatically. But if you pop any of these into Google Scholar, you'll find entire literatures. And then there's my attempt with John Haidt, Ralph Hood, Dave Vago, and Andy Newberg, Self-Transcendent experiences, which tries to kind of bring a lot of this literature together. So if you're interested, there's that 2017 paper that we wrote together that brings much of this topic together, or tries to organize it. Now, let's get back into this question that's a little bit more practical and related to positive psychology and well-being. What are the outcomes related to these experiences? So one question that I was initially very focused on was this question of, are these experiences associated with psychopathology? So William James took a very empirical approach. He was interested in positive and negative experiences as well as neutral experiences. Freud, on the other hand, felt that these experiences were symptoms of psychopathology. He thought oceanic feelings of oneness were regressions to the womb, or memories of the womb. It's pretty silly from the standpoint of contemporary psychological science. So initially, I was very interested in, well, are these experiences psychopathological in line with the Freudian view? And what we see here is that indeed, some people need therapy, and in some cases, hospitalization after these experiences. So they're by no means always positive. However, the vast majority of people, as you can clearly see, did not need the therapeutic care after them. And were the experiences rated to be ultimately positive? Again, there are some who strongly disagree. So some people are absolutely not feeling that their experience was positive, quite the opposite. But again, here you see that the vast majority are saying that these experiences were quite positive. And this is just a cross-sectional survey sample. And here's the part that I think is particularly interesting. Despite these experiences only lasting 20 to 30 minutes or so on average, many people are saying that the experience impacted their life for many years. I find that absolutely fascinating. There's very few things in life that last only a few minutes and impact for many years. And generally, they're negative. So traumas have this temporal structure. But it's difficult to think about positive experiences that are similar. And yet these altered states under certain conditions for some people seem to be impacting their lives for many years. So this is very interesting. Now, in the book, we offer a taxonomy of different kinds of altered states of consciousness. I won't really delve into this very much. I'll stay a little bit more on the surface and talk more about self-transcendent experiences, which are defined mostly by feelings of connectedness and reduced self-salience. But this is in the book if you're interested in this sort of thing. There are a number of triggers to these experiences. It's difficult, I think, to find the red thread that unites them and what the underlying common dimension might be. You can, if you figure it out, please let me know. But one particularly interesting trigger is psychedelic substances. Now, I mentioned that during my doctoral work, tried to get a number of interventions and elicitors to induce profound and meaningful and intense altered states of consciousness, but none of them worked. They were all far too subtle. People couldn't notice a difference from the non-invasive brain stimulation. The meditation took far too long for people to report any kind of altered state at all, etc. Whereas psychedelic substances very reliably induce a dramatically altered state of consciousness that under some conditions can be meaningful and sometimes can result in long-lasting positive effects. So let's move from the non-psychedelically triggered kinds of experiences to delve more into these psychedelic triggered experiences, like this number one anecdote that I began with. So I'll describe work from around the field, but more of it will focus on our Johns Hopkins Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research, just because that's where I'm based, and this QR code provides a link to our website where you can see all the studies that are ongoing at the center. There is a holiday for psychedelics. I don't know if people know this. This is April 19th, when it's called Bicycle Day. And it's called Bicycle Day because it's the day that Albert Hofmann, who is a Swiss chemist, accidentally ingested LSD in his laboratory. and he felt a little bit strange, and so he rode his bicycle home from the lab and described all of the amazing colors during that experience. So here's a little snippet from his autobiography talking about the world's first LSD experience, talking about kaleidoscopic, fantastic images, circles and spirals, every kind of sound generating an image, which is kind of synesthesia. Albert Hoffman is also the person who identified psilocybin as the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, which is so psilocybin is the psychoactive compound, and its metabolite is psilocin, which is what actually causes the experience in the brain. I should note that psychedelic use does occur in recreational contexts. This is data from the US. I need to update this because this is slightly on the rise, classic psychedelic use. And I just want to forefront the fact that psychedelics do have risks in recreational settings, especially. So there was a challenging experience survey. This was a survey advertised to people asking for people who had had a challenging experience specifically. So this is not a representative sample at all. This is specifically oriented towards people who had had a challenging experience. But it's a kind of existence proof to demonstrate that these experiences do indeed occur. And in this context, 11% reported putting themselves or others at risk of physical harm. And so this should be sobering. Certainly, these negative outcomes can and do occur. But there's interesting wrinkles to this. So many of these survey respondents said that their experience was among the most difficult of their life, among the top 10 or top 5. But surprisingly, these same people said the experience was highly meaningful and resulted in enduring change in personal well-being or life satisfaction. Now, not everyone, so it's important not to lose track of the fact that some of this sample decreased very much, and others still decreased in their well-being. So again, psychedelics have risks both acutely. So by acutely, I mean during the experience, which this upper left graph shows. And their psychedelics also have risks in a persisting manner, which this bottom right graph shows. So some people do have these detriments. But what I think is surprising here is that the vast majority of this sample specifically collected because they had a challenging experience, reported that experience resulted in more personal well-being and life satisfaction. So that's something worth trying to understand and seems paradoxical in some ways. Now, it's important to say what I mean by the term psychedelic. Some people use the term psychedelic in a broad way, others in a narrow way. Some people who use it in a broad way use psychedelic to refer to substances like MDMA, as well as ketamine, sometimes even cannabis, as well as compounds like psilocybin and LSD. For my purposes, when I say psychedelics, I will only mean what are sometimes referred to as the classic psychedelics, that the green wedge here. So psilocybin, mescaline, LSD. MDMA we consider an empathogen, or sometimes called an entactogen. And ketamine we consider a dissociative or a dissociative anesthetic. And cannabis we consider a cannabinoid. So when I say the word psychedelic, unless I specify otherwise, I'll be referring to the classic psychedelics. And actually, unless I specify otherwise, I'll almost always be referring to psilocybin because that's now the most studied of the classic psychedelics. Now, I just want to make sure that no one leaves here saying that I didn't emphasize the fact that psychedelics do have risks, especially in recreational settings. So there is a YouTube video that we made that describes some of these risks because we have this aim of public education about these risks. And what we tried to do is describe these risks in an evidence-based manner, and there is some nuance required in this because in the kind of context that I'll soon describe here in a clinical research lab, psychedelics are fairly safe. However, there are risks even there, and those risks are greatly amplified outside of that setting. There are minor adverse events from psilocybin, specifically headache and nausea that can come after the experience. These occur in a minority of participants, but they do occur. And then more major adverse events such as confusion, panic, paranoia, dissociation. These are fairly rare, but they do occur. And they occur at much higher rates in settings that are risky, both in terms of the kind of people who are surrounding the individual as well as the physical environment. So we want to make absolute sure that this message is getting across, and I want to make sure that this message is getting across that psychedelics do indeed have risks. However, I don't want to fall into fear-mongering, which has been the case for many years or decades. And just a little note here that I'm not encouraging recreational use by anything that I'm saying in this presentation. So this prison-like building is where I spend a lot of my time. This is what our lab building looks like on Bayview campus at Johns Hopkins. And this is where we hold our psilocybin sessions. So I want to describe the medical research clinical environment and what these studies look like when we administer psilocybin to people. So the first part of the process is the screen. So we're screening for pre-existing conditions, and we are looking for mostly a personal or family history of psychotic disorder, as well as cardiac issues. Those seem to be the risks for which there's the most theoretical reason for concern. They're not really well supported empirically at this point. They're mostly looked at in the mode of having an abundance of caution. There are preparatory sessions involving psychoeducation and building rapport. There are always two facilitators in the room during the dosing session, and so they're the two that conduct these preparatory sessions. There's clinical and medical oversight. One of the facilitators will be a licensed mental health care professional. The sessions are audio and video recorded. Medical doctor is on call and immediately available. And then there's multiple follow-up sessions to do safety check-ins. So here's what a typical psychedelic trial process looks like. Screening occurs initially. There are prep sessions, and then they're either given the experimental drug or the placebo. There are integration or follow-up sessions. And so this is the standard experimental design. And the general model here is that there's the drug is administered, so the psilocybin is administered. The psychedelic state, or what we call the acute subjective effects, lasts for about 6 hours. And then after that, there can be changes that are still noticeable in terms of mood and sometimes perceptual changes. And then often, but by no means always, there's long-term effects. It's important to note that during the psychedelic state, there's this idea that certain subjective qualities, what's noted here as a peak experience, but what we could call a self-transcendent kind of experience, can occur, but doesn't always occur. So the psychedelic state can involve a lot of different subjective experiences. And as we'll see, a certain kind of experience can emerge, and that certain kind of experience tends to be associated with more benefits. Now, looking at some of the outcomes from these studies, just to give you a sense for why there's so much excitement and discussion about these compounds like psilocybin, there's a tremendous mental illness rate in the world. The estimates that I know of are about 1 in 5 individuals will have a mental illness at some point in their life. So that's everyone in this room will know of someone with a mood or a substance use disorder. However, pharmacotherapies, drug therapies have been stalled for decades. So there hasn't been a new drug to come along to help treat mental illness in decades. And so studies like this one showing psilocybin reducing depression dramatically were initially looked upon with a tremendous amount of excitement. But it's important to note that this is an open label trial. And so people knew what they were getting. There's no compared to what. So there's no placebo control. And so, as is often the case, you see enormous effect sizes. But important to take these kinds of findings with an enormous grain of salt as well. Now, here's, I think, this is a New England Journal of Medicine study comparing SSRI, escitalopram, to psilocybin in those with major depression. And here, I think you're seeing some findings that are much more realistic. Here, psilocybin is no different from the SSRI on the primary outcome point. And on several of the time points, it's no different. And when it's different, it's only slightly better. Now, something important to note is the side effect profiles of psilocybin and SSRIs are very different from one another. And it may be the case that some would be more interested in or better able to tolerate psilocybin than SSRI, and vice versa. So SSRIs involve substantial weight gain and sexual side effects for many, but not all. And so many are making the argument that it would be useful to have a different option for people who are unable to tolerate other treatments. But it remains to be seen whether psilocybin in phase 3 studies will demonstrate safety and efficacy. That's not known at this point. But what I think is very interesting for our purposes here is that the change in well-being is more substantial than the reduction of depression. So psilocybin substantially increased well-being in depressed people beyond that of the SSRI. So there's a very interesting well-being effect that's worth looking into with SSRI, with psilocybin. So that was a study showing a gold standard treatment of depression, SSRIs versus psilocybin. It's pretty easy for those people to guess what they were administered. In this design, people will have a harder time guessing what they were administered. Excuse me. So this is showing 1 milligram of psilocybin, which is not psychoactive, versus 10 milligrams of psilocybin, which is substantially psychoactive, and 25 milligrams of psilocybin, which is very substantially psychoactive. But the 10 milligram and the 25 milligram group does not differ very much in the intensity of the altered state of consciousness. But what you are seeing is that the full dose is resulting in less depression over time than the medium or the low dose. So that 10 milligrams versus 25 milligrams is a decent kind of control condition, the 10 milligram group. Now, there are adverse events that do occur in this context. I just want to keep reiterating this. So the highest psilocybin dose was associated with the most suicidal ideation. That you also see this with SSRI trials. So, will psilocybin be an approved medication for depression and then other uses as well, like substance use disorders? My prediction is that yes, probably within the next 3 years or so, we'll see psilocybin approved as a medication. Again, major caveat in that it depends on how the phase 3 studies go and the FDA approval process, whether that there is approval or not. Personally, as a scientist, that's not my concern. I'm here to report facts and produce knowledge. But it is an interesting question and something we should prepare for as scientists, I think, for this possibility. But I think as psychologists, there are just so many interesting questions that are only just beginning to be explored on this topic. So this, just a note here that I've written several papers now about my worries and concerns about psychedelics and how things could go badly. Here's just one example of several. But let's dig more into why psychology should care about these compounds and the really interesting questions that they raise. So back into well-being, when you compare, here's a study comparing methylphenidate, which is Ritalin, to psilocybin. You're seeing all of these well-being related effects from psilocybin far exceeding a dose of amphetamine. So you're seeing positive attitudes about life and or self, positive mood changes, altruistic positive social effects, positive behavior changes, all from psilocybin. And so this is not just an effect of, bringing people into the lab, having them interact with really friendly, smart people who are interested in them. All of that is controlled for, and it's not just giving someone a drug experience in a safe context. The methylphenidate is controlling for that. There seems to be something particular about psilocybin that is leading people to endorse these higher well-being related changes. Now, here is, I think, what is to me the most important slide of data in all of psychology in the past 20 years or so. What this is showing is that those who were administered psilocybin, 2/3 of this sample are saying that this experience was among the most meaningful moments of their entire life. So people are saying that this experience of lying on a couch for 6 hours ranked up there with marriage and childbirth and graduations. So there's something happening entirely behind the eyes with almost no behavioral indications whatsoever that is causing people to say that this experience was profoundly meaningful. And it's not just a matter of giving someone drugs. We study abuse, liability, and risks of all kinds of different compounds in our building, cocaine, opioids, all manner of substances. And people are not saying that these drug experiences are meaningful. There appears to be something specific about psilocybin and other classic psychedelics that lead people to attribute this sense of meaning to them. So much of my work involves psychometrics and trying to understand more about what this altered state of consciousness is and why it might lead people to feel that the experience was meaningful and why it might lead people to increase higher levels of well-being after their experience. And I recently wrote a review paper on this topic. If you're interested in this, you can check out this article that goes into great depth, but I'll just provide a few highlights here of the major measures of the acute subjective effects of psychedelics, or trying to measure the trip, so to speak. There are a number of these scales in the literature. I'll just focus on a very small number here. One is the mystical experience questionnaire. Now, you'll see flags associated with each of these measures. That's not due to nationalism. That's due to this strange sociology of science kind of issue that many of these measures are used more commonly in the regions that they were created in, which I think is a problem and we need to get away from, actually. But in the US, for these sociological type reasons, the mystical experience questionnaire and the challenging experience questionnaire are most widely used. And indeed, this measure does seem to pick out something about the psilocybin experience compared to, say, methylphenidate. Here you see much higher ratings of this mystical type aspect in the psilocybin versus the methylphenidate. And this measure is essentially one of connectedness. It's described in a little bit more jargon here, this notion of internal unity, as well as positive emotion, changes in the sense of time and space, and feelings that the experience went beyond words in some way. Okay, so why do we care about this? Well, when we measure this experience, when we measure this directly after the psychedelic experience, so we say, looking back on your experience, did it have these qualities? What we see is that the higher the mystical experience score on the day of the session, the more benefits people are reporting weeks or months later. So higher mystical experience on the session day, lower levels of smoking craving weeks later, higher mystical experience score the day of, lower depression weeks later, higher mystical experience day of, lower levels of anxiety weeks later. So the acute subjective effects, certain kinds of subjective effects are predicting benefits down the line. There was a measure called the 5 or 11-dimensional altered states of consciousness scale developed in Switzerland. So this one is more used in Europe. You can see it visualized here on this radar plot. What this is showing is that responders are those who reduced in their depression by at least 50%, had weeks later, on the session day, had higher experiences of unity, more feelings of spiritual experience, more feelings of bliss, more insight, and less anxiety the day of. So this is more evidence that subjective effects on the day of the psychedelic experience predict persisting benefits. And in the UK, there's yet another measure, and many of them are measuring basically the same thing. They're extremely highly correlated with one another. Now, there's an issue here, which is that the major 3 measures of psychedelic experience are from Baltimore in the US, London in the UK, and Zurich in Switzerland. And that's a pretty small number of places, and all of those places are weird in the Joe Heinrich sense. They're Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And so ideally, as we move towards better measures in the field, they'll incorporate data and experiences from people all over the world, across different compounds and across different non-psychoactive substance-related experiences, to be much more comprehensive. And that's one of the major aims of my group right now at the moment. And we've written on this topic, and we're attempting to improve on it using a project called the Archives Project at Johns Hopkins, where we're trying to build the largest collection of psychedelic and psychedelic-like experiences in the world. This is, we meet weekly on Wednesdays. We have multiple times to accommodate different time zones in the world. So if you're interested in helping us to archive accounts of psychedelic and psychedelic-like experiences, please do reach out, as we'd love to involve you in our project. So I only have a minute left, and so I'll conclude just to say that these self-transcendent type experiences, these profound and meaningful and intense altered states of consciousness, can be triggered through different means. They can occur spontaneously, through practices like meditation, as well as through compounds like psychedelic substances, classic psychedelics like psilocybin, and that psilocybin and other compounds offer a very useful scientific tool to induce these kinds of experiences in controlled laboratory settings. So while this is exciting, I think it's important that we remain evidence-based in our discussion of psychedelics. This is a topic that tends to attract extreme negative and extreme positive statements. I think a kind of tempered and cautious optimism is warranted based on the data. If you're interested in learning more, we have a Coursera out that you're able to watch, I believe, for free, called Psychedelic Science and Medicine, put out by Johns Hopkins. I'm one of the instructors, so feel free to check that out if you're interested in learning more. And with that, thank you so much, and happy to take questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, Professor Yaden. Let's give a big hand to Professor Yaden. Thank you very much for the insightful sharing on a lot of different studies. So any questions from the chat room or from the lecture room? Feel free to type if you have any questions in the chat box. Maybe I will start. Okay. Thank you for sharing all the a lot of very interesting research findings. So my first question is, there's a chart where you mentioned about the triggers for spiritual experiences, right?
Right.
There are the top three. It mentioned about transitional period and then other, and also prayers versus like there are many other substances that could be, inducing the spiritual experiences. So my question is, first of all, what is the transitional period is, and what is other category referring to?
Yeah, transitional periods is a really interesting one. I forget why I initially included that. Well, maybe it was because I'm interested in rites of passage and how some traditional societies used rites of passage as a way to maybe acknowledge and structure the kinds of experiences that could arise during that period. I was surprised that it was endorsed so highly. I think there's something there to be followed up on, actually, and I've always meant to, and I've not done it. So if anyone's interested in pursuing that, please do reach out to me. I'd be very interested in that question. I don't know what it means, frankly, but I would like to. Your second question was about other. Yeah, so in an earlier study, I had included the other category and allowed people to write in what their trigger was. And there was one particular answer that was by far the most common, and it was childbirth. And I think it was because I'm a man, I just didn't think of childbirth, but it's completely obvious in hindsight. And it's a reminder of why having diverse scientific groups is important, because many people think it's totally obvious. And so after that, I always just tried to include the other category so people could write in. I don't recall what all people wrote in that particular study, but it's just like kind of a miscellaneous category.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Yaden. I'm very happy to reach out because I'm interested to
Great.
the categories. So we have some questions from the chat box. Any comparison with near-death experience in nature? So the first question.
Yeah, so we actually are running a study on that right now, psychedelic experiences compared to near-death experiences. The way that I think about near-death experiences is as a trigger. So being near death as the trigger of an intense and meaningful altered state of consciousness. Um, so sometimes people think that the near-death experience itself has certain characteristics that are consistent across cultures. I'm not so sure about that. I think in the scholarly literature on this topic, there's a position called perennialism, and that's the idea that these experiences are, these altered states of consciousness are pretty much the same across all history and across all cultures. Um, and then there's the opposite view, which is cultural constructivism, which is the idea that these experiences are totally different across cultures and across different historical contexts. I think that the truth is somewhere in the middle, and that we can use empirical psychology to help us understand what aspects are similar and what aspects are different. So I'd be careful of any claims that suggest, which there are a lot out there, that near-death experiences always involve a tunnel of light and um, a voice beckoning and angels or anything remotely like that. It turns out near-death experiences are pretty diverse across cultures in terms of what is encountered. Although there may be some common elements. And it absolutely is a common trigger for these altered states that we see come up in our empirical work pretty frequently. So yeah, great question.
Thank you. So a relevant question, I think that's a question in the chat box. So is the psychedelic therapy used in end-life hospice patients in the chat box?
Yeah, so there's been two studies, one at NYU and one at Johns Hopkins, on psilocybin in individuals with life-threatening cancer diagnoses. And in both studies, they found that depression and anxiety symptoms were substantially decreased in the psilocybin groups, and well-being was increased in the psilocybin groups. There's a great 60 Minutes episode that covers this research from several years ago now, and you can hear one of the participants telling her story of how the experience didn't cause her to lose fear of death, but it helped her to somehow accept it and to see it as part of this larger process that is natural, and that she is simply a small part of. And it allowed her to kind of come out of her shell of stress and despair and connect more during the months of time that she had left with her family and friends. So I think that there is a very valuable potential place to apply these compounds in the end of life context. One of my concerns, though, is that it's a very high stakes time. And so even while it might be fairly rare, those who have a very negative experience that ends up being detrimental to them, you take the risk of making things worse. So that has to be weighed. And, like any medical treatment, there are risks. Nothing works perfectly. Now you might say, well, why try it at all? Why not do psychological manipulations? And I would say it's not an it's not an either or. You can do both, and for some subset of people, they may be interested in trying this kind of experience. And what I think is interesting with these experiences is that when they work well, their effect size is dramatically larger than what you see from many purely psychological manipulations or interventions. And even there, I'd be worried that I'm drawing a false dichotomy between a pharmacotherapy and a psychological intervention, because as you've seen with this particular compound, it's creating a psychological experience, not just a simple physiological drug effect, so to speak. So I know I'm kind of throwing a lot at the wall here and circling a few different distinctions, but I guess what I want to say is I think that this is an interesting area of application with those caveats of caution, and to invite some creative thinking about how this particular psychoactive substance interacts with potential psychological interventions and psychological thinking.
Thank you, Professor Yaden. So I guess the time is probably, I need to keep the time so that you can get some rest as well, because the time zone is very different in Baltimore. So I don't see any more questions from the room. So maybe you can, the audience can send email to you maybe later if they have questions. I will also send email to ask some questions as well. So all right, thank you very much. So let's give a big hand to Professor Yaden again. Thank you.
Thank you. Enjoy the conference.
Okay,
Hope to
thank
see you
you.
soon. Bye-bye.